The joint hearings of the two select committees will come to order. Chair would simply like to announce that several members of the two panels are not present today because of the bicentennial activities celebrating the 200th anniversary of the Great Compromise in the Constitution, which is taking place in Philadelphia today. Because of that, the committees will meet only in a morning session from 9 this morning till 12 or a little thereafter, and we will reconvene at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning for a full day. We will begin this morning with the continuation of questioning by Mr. Lyman. Mr. Lyman, you may proceed, sir.
Good morning, Admiral.
Good morning.
Admiral, just before the break yesterday, we were reviewing the letters which Mr. McFarlane had sent to Chairman Hamilton and to Chairman Barnes, and you had testified that you would not have answered the letters the same way, and you said that, I'll read it, I would not have answered them the same way that Mr. McFarlane did. I would have, I think, said it in a different way and not gone into the detail that he did.
Mr. Chairman, if possible, I'd like a copy of that. Is that yesterday's transcript?
You should have it, but it's page 110.
I should have it?
Yes. I don't see it there, but you should have it, and you will be given it.
That's what I asked for. I'd like to have it given to me.
Counsel will get it to you as promptly as we can.
Now, do you remember that you were uncomfortable when you first saw that letter?
Yes. As I recall, the first time that I saw that letter was actually, I think, in the exhibits that you provided. There were extracts from it, as I recall, in the Tower Commission report, and I had seen portions of it there.
And you are aware of the testimony of Oliver North, who said he prepared it or helped prepare it, that it was wrong and misleading.
I heard that testimony.
And is it a fact that, knowing what you did about the activities of Oliver North and the NSC, that you consider the statement that you are complying with the letter and spirit of Boland to be misleading?
As I understand your last question, Mr. Lyman, you're saying that I would say that saying that the letters that said that we were complying with the letter and spirit of Boland was misleading. I haven't said that, and I don't.
Do you feel that telling Congress that you were complying with the letter and spirit of Boland, given what the NSC was doing, was a misleading statement?
As I have testified yesterday, I felt that the Boland Amendment did not apply to the NSC staff, and I felt that indeed we were complying with the letter and spirit of the Boland Amendment.
So that what you're saying...
Now, it doesn't say that we're not helping the Contras. We were.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to object. I see this question, what you're saying. He has said what he has said. That's on the record. I'd ask to go on to a question asking what he did, what he knew, not Mr. Lyman rephrasing, what you are saying as putting it into his words. We have his words on the record. I ask that that's what should stay on the record, not Mr. Lyman's interpretation of it.
Counsel, your objection is noted. I think our counsel, Mr. Lyman, has a right to clarify his understanding of the testimony. That seems to me to be appropriate. Counsel, you may proceed. The objection's overruled.
Admiral, in saying that you are complying with the letter and spirit of a law, when you mean that the law doesn't apply and that you are supporting the Contras, you do not consider that to be misleading Congress?
The only thing I admit to, Mr. Lyman, is withholding information from the Congress. I have not said that we weren't helping the Contras. We clearly were helping the Contras. But we were also trying very hard to stay within the letter and spirit of Boland by keeping the other departments that were covered by the Boland Amendment out of the issue.
So that in saying that you are complying with the letter and spirit of Boland, what you mean is that the NSC was doing the support without the CIA.
That was my understanding.
And did the President understand that?
I think he did understand that.
What's that based on?
In a general way, he understood that the Contras were being supported and that we were involved in generally in coordinating the effort. He was aware of the contributions from Country 2, and he himself felt personally, as related to me, that it was entirely appropriate for private individuals to support the Contras, and he was aware of the status of the Contras in the field, the kinds of things that he was briefed on. I think would have made that clear.
Did you? Sorry.
No, I was just going to add that he was not briefed on every little issue involved in coordinating this effort. As I have testified before, the items that he was briefed on were primarily in the policy area, and it was a judgment call every day as to exactly what level of detail I had to get into.
Well,
that doesn't mean that that I was trying to withhold information from him. It was just a matter of giving him the information that I felt that was most important, depending on the circumstances of the day.
Did you brief the President on the fact that the NSC was helping the Contras?
Mr. Chairman, that question has been asked and answered innumerable times. I'd ask that we move on. Please.
No?
Counsel, I think your objection is overruled just because our counsel has the right to emphasize points that he thinks important.
Did you brief the President on the fact that the NSC staff was helping the Contras?
Mr. Lyman, as I have testified yesterday, I am not going to answer a question in a positive way unless I can remember a specific conversation. I have told you in general what I briefed the President on, and I don't recall a specific conversation that would allow me to answer your question in an affirmative way.
Okay. Now, or a negative way.
Or a negative way.
Right. Now, Admiral, when you said that you felt that Mr. McFarland's statements were too categorical, is it a fact, sir, that in the summer of 1986, you yourself had to write to Congress in connection with an inquiry then about Mr. North?
Mr. Chairman, I am going to object, and here's the reason why. Mr. Lyman said, isn't it a fact that you, Admiral Poindexter, said the letters were too categorical? Admiral Poindexter has never testified to that. In his May 2nd deposition, he said something to the effect that I would never have written the letters that way. However, Mr. Lyman, since May 2nd, has been trying to get Admiral Poindexter to say the letters were too categorical. We have denied that over and over and over, but he's not going to stop. He wants to get him to say it's too categorical. He has not said that, and I would ask the court, I would ask the chairman, to just bear in mind, when he asks a question, he should ask the question and not put his own facts built into it.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Counsel.
I think that Mr. Beckler is mistaken, that the witness did in fact say that some of the language,
Could we read the full question and answer?
56, you can look at it and let the Admiral look at it.
The Chair would like to observe, counsel, that if our counsel's question does not meet with the approval of the witness can object to the way counsel has phrased the question or characterized the question. So rather than making an objection, it seems to me the appropriate response is for the witness simply to indicate his disagreement with the premise or the predicate of the question. The witness has every right to do that.
Mr. Chairman, I understand the witness has a right to do that, but I also have a right to do that. I have a right as counsel for Admiral Poindexter to make objections to questions that I think are severely prejudicial and have no foundation in fact. That's my right. In fact, it's my duty as his counsel to do that. Now, I understand he has the power and the right also to raise objections.
Counsel, may I suggest to you that I understand, of course, that your experience is in a court of law and not so much before congressional hearings. This is not a court of law. Admiral Poindexter is not on trial here. We are simply trying to elicit information from him because we believe him to be a very important witness so that we can understand the processes of government and what happened here. So we have a very different perspective, as I've suggested to you before. There's no effort on the part of this committee to put Admiral Poindexter on trial. We're not trying to do that.
And Mr. Chairman, may I respond? I understand you're not trying to put Admiral Poindexter on trial. There is, of course, as we know, somebody else who's trying to do that. And this is what bears upon it. I pointed this out to Mr. Lyman before. Mr. Lyman, because of the agreements he reached with the independent counsel, and I alluded to this yesterday in my opening argument, has in a sense, Mr. Lyman has in a sense been victimized by the independent counsel because he has agreed with the independent counsel as to when testimony of Admiral Poindexter will be taken, as to how long that testimony will be kept shut down, as to what documents we will be given or not given in preparation for his testimony. In fact, the device of handing me back transcripts from yesterday, or actually forget about that, the transcript from the May 2nd deposition was not available until several months later. Why? Because the independent counsel said that's the way it's got to be if you're going to give him immunity. They're threaded through this entire pre-open hearing stage. There have been all kinds of agreements reached with the independent counsel which have severely hampered my client's ability to prepare himself. We were asking the White House back in December for documents. Mr. Wallison at the White House said, the check's in the mail, so to speak. We're sending them to you. Weeks went by, we never got them. We wrote him a letter. We called. Never got them. Why? Because the independent counsel said the White House cannot turn over documents. Now, finally, Mr. Lyman himself told me before the May 2nd deposition that, and I mentioned this yesterday, I want to test the Admiral's credibility. I want to have him go in there cold without seeing any records. And I said, all right, Mr. Lyman, we'll do that. We'll go in there cold without any records. And we did. But I also understood from Mr. Lyman that right after that cold session was done, we were going to get to see our records. And we were going to get transcripts of that testimony. We never got any of that until the last few weeks. Now, I'm not impugning this committee by saying that you're trying to conduct a trial up here. But the long arm of the independent counsel has reached right down into the core of this committee and has structured every arrangement that we have had with this committee in terms of providing Admiral Poindexter with fair and reasonable access to the materials that he needs. Now, he went on the line And he has no problem saying what he has said here yesterday and today, and for 5 more days if you want to keep him here. But the idea of flipping him back to prior testimony without giving us the adequate access, I think, is where the independent counsel's hand plays in here. And I want to make that clear.
Mr. Chairman?
Thank you.
Mr. Redmond? Senator Redmond?
Yes, thank you, Chairman.
I know.
Chairman, I think counsel's statement need a couple of comments. Number one, Mr. Lyman, of course, Mr. Chairman, has no authority to make any agreement whatsoever on behalf of this committee. This committee has respected the difficult position that everyone is in, and has tried to observe the proper comedy between the needs of the justice system and the needs of the Congress. There have been no agreements reached whatsoever. Every decision has been by vote of the committee. Now, these are not decisions Arthur Lyman is authorized to make, nor have there been any agreements by the committee. Number two, I want the record to show that every record that is within the control of the committee has been furnished to counsel for Admiral Poindexter. And the third thing I want to observe is, for reasons that I think counsel fully understands, records of those depositions were sealed by order of the committees, not Mr. Lyman. And I think there has been a decided advantage to that, to Admiral Poindexter, because his testimony before these committees has been fresh. I think it's been candid. It has not been influenced by a number of no sources stories over a 8-week period, because the Admiral obviously hasn't talked to anybody about his testimony, neither has the committee. Well, I think the characterization by Mr. Beckler, which I understand he's a very able lawyer, and even able lawyers occasionally go over a line of fairness, and this committee is trying to be fair to Mr. Beckler's client. Mr. Beckler, if you want to respond to what I have to say, if you would like to differ, you're already right. I want to just make the observation that there has been no agreement with this committee with anyone. We have tried to observe the comity that is historical between the Congress and the Justice Department in certain kinds of situations. There is ample precedent for that in a number of congressional committees. So I just want to observe that this committee is trying to be fair with your client, and we hope you'll be fair with us.
Thank you, Senator Redmond.
Senator Nunn.
Mr. Chairman, back to the objection the council made relating to the question posed by Mr. Lyman about whether the Admiral Poindexter felt the McFarland letter was too categorical. I think if council will simply read transcript page 56, you will see that Admiral Poindexter has already agreed that the McFarland letter was too categorical. So the original objection of council, seems to me, is out of order and has no bearing on the council's point.
Senator Nunn, if you could direct me to that portion on page 56 where Admiral Poindexter says, in his own words, it was too categorical, I'd like to read it.
Oh, well, you added in his own words. He agreed with Mr. Lyman's description of it as being too categorical. The language says, the question says, and when you saw it in the Tower Commission report, you said there was some language in it which you felt was more categorical than you would have used. Is that fair to say? That's the question. The answer, I think that is fair to say.
Well, Mr. Senator, if you have to go back, now this was on the fourth day of depositions. Mr. Lyman kept going over and over, and I read from page 56, from the bottom of page 55. Question, you indicated that sometime later, almost a year later, you received a copy of Mr. McFarland's response and that you thought that some of his responses were phrased more broadly than you would have been had you been the author of this letter. Now, that was what Admiral Poindexter had repeatedly testified to before that question. I will show you Exhibit 53, the question goes on, which is a September 12, 85 response to Congressman Barnes, and ask you to look at it. I have only one question. Whether the statement in the second paragraph which says, based on this review, I want to assure you that my actions and those of my staff have been in compliance with both the spirit and the letter of the law, is one of those sentences you felt too categorical. Answer. To correct what you said a moment ago, I don't think I have ever seen this. At some point in August of '86, I asked Commander Thompson if he had, this was in conjunction with the letter Chairman Hamilton sent me, I asked Commander Thompson if he had a copy of Mr. McFarland's response the previous year. He said he did. I said I may want to look at it. I never got around to looking at it. I have seen excerpts of this in the Tower Commission report. And when you saw it in the Tower Commission report, you said there was some language in it which you felt was more categorical than you would have used. Is that fair to say? Answer, I think that is fair to say. Now, that question was asked over and over. What my objection was is that Admiral Poindexter, from the beginning, has testified that he wouldn't have written the letters this way. But I am saying that Mr. Lyman, for some reason, wants him to use the word categorical, and he will continually ask him over and over, is it fair to say, is it fair to say? And that's my point.
Mr. Chairman.
Yeah.
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Sarbanes.
Mr. Chairman, I want to observe that under the procedures of the committee, Admiral Poindexter is permitted to consult repeatedly with his counsel, Mr. Beckler, that this has happened frequently, that when a question has been put, he's been drawn aside and they've had consultation and advice before he makes the response, and therefore he's able to respond on the basis of his conversations with counsel. There's no court in the country where that procedure would be permitted. The witness would be in a chair and the questions would be put and the witness would have to handle them on his own. Now, the committee has extended that opportunity, and I think it's a clear mark of the fairness of the committee and an appreciation of the sensitivity in which the Admiral finds himself with respect to a separate proceeding. But I simply want to note that Mr. Beckler has that opportunity and has used it frequently. And as questions are put time and time again, the Admiral has deferred his response to the question, availed himself of the opportunity to consult with his counsel, sometimes for an extended period, before he makes his response.
I thank the Senator. Counsel, you used a phrase a moment ago that I must say caused me some concern. You said that the long arm of the independent counsel has reached into every activity of these committees. I just want to say to you that these committees are required by statute, when the immunity process is in order, to notify the independent counsel, and we have done that as the statute requires us to do so. But I think it's quite correct to say that your statement about the long arm of the independent counsel reaching into every activity of these committees is totally and absolutely false. We do not confer with the independent counsel, except as the statutes require us to do so. And your suggestion that the independent counsel is controlling the activities of these select committees, I find most disturbing, and I reject it categorically. Now, our purpose this morning is to take the testimony of Admiral Poindexter. That's what we're here for, and we'd like to proceed. Counsel?
Admiral Poindexter, would you look at Exhibit 14?
That's 16. Yes, I have it, and I've just read it.
Is that a letter that you sent to Chairman Hamilton as a result of an inquiry into Colonel North's activities in support of the Contras?
It is a letter I wrote, but the description of it I would make differently. Sometime in the late summer of 1986, a resolution was introduced into the House, a resolution of inquiry, It was referred by the House legislative process to 3 committees of the House. It was referred to the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, the House Armed Services Committee, and the House Foreign Relations Committee. All 3 of those chairmen, as I recall, wrote to me and asked the administration's position on the resolution. The administration was against the resolution. These letters were written back to the chairman to provide the administration position on the resolution of inquiry that had been introduced, and that resolution was later, I'm not sure of the right term, but I think tabled or it was killed.
Was the inquiry that the resolution was directed to an inquiry into the activities of Colonel North and the NSC staff in support of the Contras?
I can't remember the exact wording of the resolution, but it was something close to that.
When you sent this letter to Chairman Hamilton, did you intend him to rely upon your word as expressed in that letter?
I intended to answer the question that and give the administration position that we were opposed to the resolution and that the questions had been addressed by Mr. McFarland in the previous year.
Did you intend for Chairman Hamilton to rely upon your word as expressed in that letter?
I intended for Chairman Hamilton to not vote for or put out a report from his committee that was in favor of the resolution. As it turns out, the House Armed Services Committee addressed the issue first, and they voted to not recommend the resolution. I think I'm not an expert on congressional procedure, so I may be using the wrong terms, but the House Armed Services Committee put out a negative report. Later in the month, Chairman Hamilton called me and indicated that the House Armed Services Committee had put out a negative report, and under the rules of the House, that really was all that needed to be done. There was no further action that was required, but that he thought that it would be helpful if the House Intelligence Committee had an opportunity to talk to Colonel North in an informal way. He said that he was not personally going to push the issue, and we had a discussion about the various forums that could be used for such a meeting. I made the point, as I recall, that I didn't want to establish the precedent of an NSC staff officer testifying before a congressional committee, because the White House, this White House, and previous White Houses have been very strong on the point that they didn't want the presidential staff, the personal staff of the president, testifying on the Hill, and we did not want to set a precedent. And after some discussion with the chairman and with my staff, it was agreed that Colonel North could informally meet with the committee in the Situation Room, and that was acceptable to Chairman Hamilton, and that took place.
Do you believe
this was all, excuse me, Mr. Lyman, this was all after the resolution of inquiry was essentially killed.
Do you believe that you cannot answer my question as to whether you intended Chairman Hamilton to rely upon your word with a yes or no answer?
I intended to withhold information from Chairman Hamilton, which I did and which I have admitted to yesterday. I wanted to withhold information on the NSC operational activities in support of the Contras from most everybody.
Now, let me read this letter. It says, this is in reply to your letter to the President of June 25, 1986, requesting comments on House Resolution 485 relating to the allegations of improper activities by members of the National Security Council staff in support of the Nicaraguan resistance. The administration strongly opposes enactment of the resolution. Now, in that sentence, you stated the administration position that it opposed the resolution.
Yes, we oppose it very vigorously.
Now, you went on to say, last fall, in an effort to cooperate with Chairman Barnes, my predecessor, Robert C. McFarland, met with members of your committee and the House Foreign Affairs Committee. While I did not participate in these discussions, I understand that information on the specific issues raised in House Resolution 485 was provided to your committee, and that this information made it clear that the actions of the National Security Council staff were in compliance with both the spirit and letter of the law regarding support of the Nicaraguan resistance. Thank you for the opportunity to comment on House Resolution 485. I have forwarded similar letters to Chairman Fasell and Chairman Aspen, and sincerely hope this matter can finally be put to rest. Did you write that letter, sir?
I didn't write it, but I signed it. My staff prepared it for me.
When you signed that letter, did you agree with the statements in it?
Yes, and I still do. I think it's an accurate letter. It doesn't tell everything. It withholds information, but it is accurate.
Did you intend to associate yourself with Mr. McFarland's statement that the staff was in compliance with the letter and spirit of the law, or were you just simply repeating his statement? What was your intent in that language?
Mr. Lyman, I'm not sure I understand your question.
Did you intend in sending this letter to associate yourself with the statement that the National Security Council staff was in compliance with both the spirit and letter of the law?
Mr. Lyman, as I've testified yesterday and today, I have always felt that the Boland Amendment did not apply to the NSC staff, and that the NSC staff was complying with the letter and spirit of the law. The letter says what it says. I think it's accurate. It withholds information. It clearly withholds information.
Well, is one of the facts that it withholds that you felt that Boland did not apply to the NSC staff?
It withholds that information, yes.
Now, when you say that you always felt that the NSC staff wasn't covered by Boland, is it a fact, sir, that at a time when a proposal was made in 1985 by Colonel North to sink the Menimbo, you wrote a note that this couldn't be done because of Boland?
No, that is not an accurate description of that note, Mr. Lyman, and I think you know that.
May we have a copy of that note, please?
It's an exhibit.
May I have the exhibit number?
Exhibit 6, and I'd like to go over it with you.
Let's read it carefully. Are you referring to the one-page handwritten?
No, Exhibit 6 is actually several pages, and it's so in your book.
Yeah.
Let's read the whole thing. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to take a minute here to read this.
You may do so.
Thank you.
May the record reflect, Mr. Chairman, that this is an exhibit that they have seen before, that they've been given access to it, and that they should look at it now because they've been given access to lots of documents.
I'm going to let that one pass by. I think I have a right to spend a few minutes with my client looking at a 5-page exhibit.
I agree.
Chair indicated you have that right, sir.
Where do you say
Even I was going to give the long explanation. I'm going to need more time because the way it's going. Six questions on.
Mr. Lyman, I've refreshed my memory on it now.
Now, if you look at this memorandum, and I'll give you a chance to make a statement, but I'd like some questions answered first.
I resent that remark. He has answered all questions.
I would like to...
Do you disagree with that, Mr. Lyman? That this witness is not answering your questions?
No, he is answering my questions. I want him to answer the questions.
Counsel, may I remind you to address your remarks to the chair, please?
I'm very sorry, Mr. Chairman.
And may I also remind you that we have a microphone. We hear very well, and if you'll speak directly into the microphone, we can hear you.
Thank you.
Did Colonel withdraw that? This is a memorandum relating to a ship that was going to be delivering arms to the Sandinistas.
That is correct.
And Colonel North sent a memorandum to Mr. McFarlane, and you were one of the people who got a copy of it, correct?
That is correct. Actually, it came through me, I believe.
And Colonel North recommended, under the recommendation, and I'll read it, that you, referring to Mr. McFarlane, authorize Calero to be provided with the information on Menimbo and approached on the matter of seizing or sinking the ship. Then there's a notation or a type thing for approved or disapproved, which is not checked. And is the handwriting there yours?
That is mine.
And it says, we need to take action to make sure ship does not arrive in Nicaragua, and then that's your initials, JP.
That's correct.
Now, on the first, if you turn to the sheet that is the beginning of the exhibit, it has a date of February 7 on it, which is the day after the date of the memo.
Right.
And is that a buck slip that you sent to Mr. McFarlane passing on this memorandum?
That's correct. That's correct. It's just a short cover note.
And am I reading your writing correctly? Except for the prohibition of the intelligence community doing anything to assist the freedom fighters, I would readily recommend I bring this up at the CPPG meeting at 2 o'clock today. Of course, we could discuss it from the standpoint of keeping the arms from Nicaragua without any involvement of Calero and freedom fighters. What do you think, JP? Is that your writing?
It is.
In the sentence that says, except for the prohibition of the intelligence community doing anything to assist the freedom fighters, was the prohibition that you were referring to the Boland Amendment?
It was.
Now, did you ever ask the Attorney General of the United States for his opinion on whether the Boland Amendment applied to the NSC?
Now, wait a minute, Mr. Lyman. You said you were going to give me an opportunity to make a statement on this note, and I think you're passing that by at this point. I would like to explain that note. I've answered your questions. I've answered them truthfully. Now, I'd like to provide an explanation as to what that note means.
Please proceed.
What that note means is exactly what I've been saying all along, that we were doing everything we could to make sure that we complied with the letter and spirit of the Boland Amendment. I did not want to discuss these issues with anybody to which the Bolton Amendment applied. That was the State Department, the CIA, and the Defense Department. The CPPG is a crisis pre-planning group, which I chaired as the Deputy Assistant Secretary, or Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs. And on that group, I had representatives from the CIA, from the State Department, and for the Defense Department. So what I meant in that note, and I think it's very clear once you understand the background, is that I did, except for the Bolton Amendment applying to these other guys, we could discuss it. But we couldn't discuss it in those terms because the Bolton Amendment applied to them. It did not apply to the NSC staff.
Did Colonel North ask the NSC to provide information to Calero on the Menimbo?
Would you repeat your last question, Mr. Leonard?
Was Colonel North seeking permission for him to provide information on the Menimbo to Calero? Isn't that what he was saying?
That was the request that he was making. There are some other points that I want to make, though, and that is that in that first sentence where I say, except for the prohibition of the intelligence community, and what I'm referring to there is that's the Boland Amendment applying to the CIA, the State Department, and the Defense Department. And because those people were going to be involved in the meeting, I didn't think it would be appropriate to discuss that issue. Now, one of our objectives in the Central America program, which was covered in very early findings that the President signed in 81 and 82, I think, one of our objectives was to stop the arms flow into Nicaragua so that we would reduce the arms flow into El Salvador, Honduras, and the surrounding countries. And so from that standpoint, of stopping the arms flow, I felt that that was something that could be discussed.
I've just heard your testimony, which was that it would have been a violation of Boland for you to discuss this with the CIA and State Department and the Defense Department, correct?
That's correct.
But you considered it consistent with the letter and spirit of Boland for you to provide that information on the ship?
I did not have any problem with it. As it turns out, I can't remember exactly what happened here, but the plan was never executed.
You've testified that one of your duties was to implement presidential policies on national security.
That's correct.
Did that include the National Security Directive 159?
Would you refresh my memory on the subject of that?
That's the directive that says that if any agency other than the CIA is to undertake certain covert operations, that the President should designate that agency. Do you recall that? I can show it to you. It's an exhibit.
Yeah, may I see that, please?
What number is it?
House exhibit. Do you have the House exhibit quickly? It's Exhibit 101, and let me just read to you. In accordance with Executive Order 1233, the Central Intelligence Agency shall conduct covert actions unless the President specifically designates another agency of government. Were you familiar with that provision?
Yes, in fact, as I recall, I participated in the drafting of that NSDD. Because one of the features of it, I think, was that this sets up a group that I chaired, which is covered in, I guess, in another part of it that you don't have here.
Did the President of the United States ever designate the NSC to undertake the activities in support of the Contras that you have testified the NSC was doing?
Let me make this clear. As I testified yesterday, the word covert action is not a statutory term. I would not necessarily have characterized the NSC's support for the Contra activity as a covert action. The covert actions used in most cases is a shorthand term for the statutory language in the Hughes-Ryan Act of special activities of the intelligence community. Those activities that are not involved in intelligence collection and analysis. The Hughes-Ryan Act, or amendment to the National Security Act, applies to the intelligence community. Executive Order 12333 applies to the intelligence community. This NSDD prescribes the procedures to be followed by the administration to carry out the provisions of the Hughes-Ryan Amendment to the National Security Act. The NSC staff is not covered in any of that.
Can you answer the question now? Did the President designate the NSC to conduct the activities in support of the Contras that you have described in your testimony yesterday?
In effect, he did, Mr. Lyman, but not through a finding. A finding was not required.
I'm not talking about a finding. You said in effect.
I want to make it clear, as I said yesterday, and as Mr. McFarland has testified, the President, in effect, wanted the National Security Council staff to make sure that the Contras remained alive until we could turn the vote around in the Congress and return to a program that was supported with appropriated funds.
Well, when we're talking about the President of the United States, I think we would both agree that we shouldn't talk about what he did in effect. Did the President ever designate in words and substance of words the NSC to conduct the activities in support of the Contras that you described yesterday?
I would not characterize it that way at all. As I said, if you take the totality of the President's actions, that was clearly his intent.
But he did not communicate that in words.
May I ask that the witness be allowed to finish his answer before Mr. Lyman gives his preordained conclusion?
Witness may respond.
There was no written finding on this activity because none was required.
Was there an oral designation by the President of the NSC to carry on the activities that you described?
There was not a specific designation that you're trying to define that I know about.
But you are you saying that you understood the President to want the NSC to do that?
That is correct.
Now, you raised some questions about definition of covert actions.
Yes.
Is it true that your support for the Contras was intended to be covert?
Covert in the sense of being secret. That doesn't mean that it is covert as usually accepted as referring to special activities of the intelligence community.
And you would also agree that they were actions that the NSC staff was taking in the form of Colonel North, not just prof notes.
They were very clearly actions.
Now,
I've testified to that before.
Can you-
Colonel North was essentially the switching point that made the operation work after the Boland Amendment.
can you...
Mr. Chairman, this line of questioning, we've been over this. Yes, I thought yesterday we spent a great deal of time discussing what was authorized and what was not. I'd ask that the council move on.
At page 24, 324 of the Tower Report, referring to the President, they say, that the President did not know that the NSC staff was engaged in helping the Contras based on your briefing, sir?
I have not talked to the President, Mr. Lyman, since I left the White House on the 25th of November. I have not discussed this issue with him. I don't know exactly how the question was phrased or exactly what the President had in mind when he provided that answer. My understanding is that since that time, he has modified that position a little bit.
And one of your duties as National Security Advisor, you said, was to brief the President. Did you brief the President about the fact that the NSC staff was, to use the words of the Tower Report, helping the Contras?
Again, as I testified yesterday, I want to be very careful and I want to recall a specific conversation with the President before I would answer that in an affirmative way. I do not recall a specific conversation in that regard, but I don't think that's unusual because I would not get into the details with the President as to who was doing what. The President knew that there was a Boland Amendment. He knew there were restrictions on the government. As he has said, I think, since November of 1986, that he did not feel that the Boland Amendment applied to his personal staff, and that was his feeling all along. I knew that. He knew that the Contras were being supported, and we simply didn't get into the details of exactly who was doing what. He understood that Colonel North was the Chief Action Officer on Central America. Colonel North was always there when there were briefings in detail as to what was happening in Central America. Colonel North was there when various foreign officials that were involved, and so the President, I think, clearly associated with it. Now, you know, the President doesn't recall apparently a specific briefing in which I laid out in great detail all of the ways that we were going about implementing the President's policy, and I frankly don't find that surprising. It would not, frankly, at that time have been a matter of great interest as to exactly how we were implementing the President's policy.
But yesterday, in explaining why you felt that the authorization of the diversion by you was consistent with the President's policies and was something that, had you told him, he would have approved, you were basing that on your discussions with the President.
That is correct.
not discussions of the diversion, let's make it
No.
clear, but
No.
discussions of supporting the Contras.
That's correct.
Now, to come back to the question that I asked before, did you ever ask the opinion of the Attorney General on whether the Boland Amendment applied to the NSC?
Not in any sort of formal way.
I don't, even informally?
Yeah, I can't recall. We conceivably could have discussed the Boland Amendment at various points, but I don't have a sharp recollection of
Do
it.
you have any recollection of the Attorney General telling you that the NSC staff was free from the prohibitions of the Boland Amendment?
I don't have any clear recollection of that, but also I don't have any recollection that he said that it applied to the NSC staff.
Did you ever tell the Attorney General that the NSC staff was assisting the Contras?
No, I don't recall that.
Now, during your tenure as both Deputy and National Security Advisor, the President had two persons who served in the office of counsel to the President, correct?
Yes, Mr. Fielding and Mr. Wallison.
And the NSC is part of the President's staff.
It's part of the Executive Office of the President, right?
Did you ever seek the opinion of either Mr. Fielding or The President told the board on January 26, 1987, that he did not know that the NSC staff was engaged in helping the Contras. The
Mr.
board
Lyman,
is aware,
excuse me, could you tell us where on page 24?
page 3, you see Roman numeral 3, 24, last paragraph. I'll read it again.
Roman numeral 3, 24.
Yes. The President told the board on January 26, 1987, that he did not know that the NSC staff was engaged in helping the Contras. The board is aware of no evidence to suggest that the President was aware of Lieutenant Colonel North's activities. Now, can you shed any light on the statement that the President did not know that the NSC staff was engaged in helping the Contras based on your briefing, sir?
I have not talked to the President, Mr. Lyman, since I left the White House on the 25th of November. I have not discussed this issue with him. I don't know exactly how the question was phrased or exactly what the President had in mind when he provided that answer. My understanding is that since that time, he has modified that position a little bit.
And one of your duties as National Security Advisor, you said, was to brief the President. Did you brief the President about the fact that the NSC staff was, to use the words of the Tower Report, helping the Contras?
Again, as I testified yesterday, I want to be very careful and I want to recall a specific conversation with the President before I would answer that in an affirmative way. I do not recall a specific conversation in that regard, but I don't think that's unusual because I would not get into the details with the President as to who was doing what. The President knew that there was a Boland Amendment. He knew there were restrictions on the government. As he has said, I think, since November of 1986, that he did not feel that the Boland Amendment applied to his personal staff, and that was his feeling all along. I knew that. He knew that the Contras were being supported, and we simply didn't get into the details of exactly who was doing what. He understood that Colonel North was the chief action officer on Central America. Colonel North was always there when there were briefings in detail as to what was happening in Central America. Colonel North was there when various foreign officials that were involved, and so the President, I think, clearly associated with it. Now, you know, the President doesn't recall apparently a specific briefing in which I laid out in great detail all of the ways that we were going about implementing the President's policy, and I frankly don't find that surprising. It would not, frankly, at that time have been a matter of great interest as to exactly how we were implementing the President's policy.
But yesterday, in explaining why you felt that the authorization of the diversion by you was consistent
Right.
with the President's policies and was something that, had you told him, he would have approved, you were basing that on your discussions with the President.
That is correct.
Not discussions of the diversion, let's make it
No.
clear, but
No.
discussions of supporting the Contras.
That's correct.
Now, to come back to the question that I asked before, did you ever ask the opinion of the Attorney General on whether the Boland Amendment applied to the NSC?
Not in any sort of formal way.
I don't, even informally.
Yeah, I can't recall. We conceivably could have discussed the Boland Amendment at various points, but I don't have a sharp recollection of
Do
it.
you have any recollection of the Attorney General telling you that the NSC staff was free from the prohibitions of the Boland Amendment?
I don't have any clear recollection of that, but also I don't have any recollection that he said that it applied to the NSC staff.
Did you ever tell the Attorney General that the NSC staff was assisting the Contras?
No, I don't recall that.
Now, during your tenure as both Deputy and National Security Advisor, the President had two persons who served in the office of counsel to the President, correct?
Yes, Mr. Fielding and Mr. Wallison.
And the NSC is part of the President's staff.
It's part of the Executive Office of the President, right?
Did you ever seek the opinion of either Mr. Fielding or Mr. Wallison as to whether the NSC was covered by the Boland Amendment?
I personally did not. I'm not sure about the rest of my staff, whether they did or not.
Did anyone
But
ever...
I must say that we seldom refer to any issues to the White House counsel.
Did anyone tell you that their views had been sought?
I don't recall that. Commander Thompson was the general counsel of the staff at the time, and he was the usual contact with Mr. Fielding's office or Mr. Wallison's.
Now, I think everyone noted that the letter that I read to you, which you sent to Chairman Hamilton, was in response to a letter that was addressed to the President of the United States.
Yes.
Did you show your response to that letter to the President of the United States?
Probably not.
Did you discuss with the President what your response was?
I think in general terms, I probably did. I probably told him about the resolution of inquiry and told him that we were opposed to it. He agreed.
Did you tell him that you were going to be indicating that you were in compliance with letter and spirit of Boland?
I don't recall the conversation specifically.
Did you
no.
review that letter with the Chief of Staff, Don Reagan?
I did not. The staff may have. It was the letters addressed to the President from members of Congress come into the Legislative Affairs Office, headed up by Will Ball during this time frame, and the letter is then tasked out, and Will's staff and mine worked together to get the appropriate clearances. When the clearances came in, the letter was sent to me to sign, and I signed it because I felt it was accurate, and I thought the staff had done a good job of staffing it.
And you said that the letter was prepared for you by someone. Was it prepared for you by Colonel North?
I don't know that.
Now, you also testified earlier about the fact that Colonel North submitted to an interview.
He did.
And Colonel North has said that in that interview, he gave answers that were evasive and wrong. You've heard that testimony.
I heard his testimony last week.
Did you, in fact, and you can look at Exhibit 15, receive a report on what Colonel North told Congress in his interview? Is that a prof note you received?
Yes, it is a prof's note it's from Mr. Pearson, who is the Deputy Executive Secretary of the Staff.
And it indicated that Oliver North covered some points, correct? Indicated various things that he had said in substance.
It starts off by saying, in fact, I think it might be helpful to read it.
Session, I will. Session was success. Hamilton will entertain motions soonest to report unfavorably on resolution of inquiry and made clear believes that that HIPSI, the Intelligence Committee of the House, can turn aside future offers of similar resolutions. North's remarks were thorough and convincing. Hamilton underlined his appreciation to Admiral and to us, I think, for full cooperation.
I think it's to Bud.
And to Bud for full cooperation offered by NSC. He restated that there were no facts uncovered by or known to HIPSI to substantiate the allegations in the resolution of inquiry or media reports on North's activities. In response to specific questions, Ali covered following points. Contact with FDN and UNO, which are the resistance organizations, aimed to foster viable democratic political strategy for Nicaraguan opposition, gave no military advice, knew of no specific military operations. Next, Singlab gave no advice, has had no contact in 20 months. Owen never worked from Oliver North's office. Oliver North had casual contact, never provided Owen guidance. And then it says threats, harassments. In response to question, Oliver North recounted incidents of harassments, threats prior to 85 vote, and again prior to 86 vote, speculated that possibly due in part to active measures effort. Now, North testified that these statements about Singlab and about Owen and about the fact that he knew of no military, specific military operations, and what else he had said to the committee were wrong and misleading. Is it a fact, sir, that in response to this note from Mr. Pearson, that you had a two-word response, well done?
I responded by forwarding a copy of Mr. Pearson's note to me to Colonel North, and I did tell him well done. Well done meant that I was pleased that the session was a success and that Chairman Hamilton seemed satisfied. Our objective here all along was to withhold information. There's no question about that.
Let's move.
And that was my intent all along. I had talked to Colonel North after talking to Chairman Hamilton and asked him if he could meet with the committee, and he said that he could and he could handle it. There had been a lot of false allegations in the press. I expected Colonel North to be very careful in answering the specific questions. I thought he could knock down a lot of the issues by being truthful. By reading the summary in this note, I didn't attach any great significance to it because I knew that the questions and answers would be very carefully crafted. I did not have any indication at this point that Colonel North had made a false statement. I expected him to withhold information. In fact, I'm still not sure to this day, if you looked at the questions and the answers that he gave, whether you would conclude that there were false statements.
Did you think that the most effective way of knocking down false allegations about Colonel North's activities was by withholding information, the word you just used?
Yes, I thought that was an effective way of doing it.
Now, let's move on. There were 3 arms transactions that actually took place pursuant to the January 17 finding. The 1,000 tows in February, the Hawk parts, which were paid for in May, and then the 500 tows that were shipped to the second channel in October, correct?
That is correct.
And each of these transactions was approved by you?
That's correct, and the President.
And by the President. Were there briefing notes or memoranda that you received from Colonel North on each of these transactions?
There were lots of notes and prof's notes from Colonel North. I can't recall all of them, but I would think that most of them were covered by either hard copy written memos or notes or prof's notes.
Well, was it Colonel North's practice to prepare a briefing memorandum for you when you had to get the President's approval for a transaction such as the arms transactions we're talking about?
That was his normal practice.
And how would you brief the President, orally or by giving him a copy of the memorandum?
Usually orally. I would use the paper that Colonel North prepared as talking points, and if it was very detailed and I thought that the President might be interested in it, I would sometimes read it, but more often I would summarize it.
Now, Colonel North said that in each of these memoranda that related to the arms transfers, he described how the residuals would be used for the support of the Contras. Do you recall that, sir?
I recall his testimony. I do not recall the memos.
We do not have, I'll say this as a fact, we do not have a single one of the memoranda for those transactions except the draft memos that he prepared in April for a transaction that didn't happen and was then restructured in May. And therefore, I haven't been able to show you any of those memos. Do you, sir, know what happened, personally know what happened to those memos?
I do not.
You've
You
only heard-
do have some exhibits, though, that address next steps. They don't address diversion.
They
And
don't.
I think you've got at least one that has a specific note on it from me that I've briefed the President and he has approved. That
But
was.
those were next step memos on the initiative.
That's correct. They didn't say anything about the diversion.
No, but they also, we do not have any of the memos that describe, as did that draft April memo, the transaction that was about to take place and that the President and you approved. Those memos are gone. Colonel North said they've all been shredded. I was asking you if you had any personal knowledge on that fact.
I do not.
Now, did you believe that all of what Colonel North called the residuals, or called the profits, were going to be used for the Contras?
That was my understanding.
And did you ever ask Colonel North how much money these sales were generating for the Contras?
No, I never did,
Did he ever tell you?
that I can recall.
Was there a reason why you didn't ask him how much money we're getting for the Contras out of these sales?
Your question was, did I ask him?
My question was, why didn't you...
Why did I not ask him?
Given your interest in the financing of the Contras, which you've
Right.
expressed, and you've explained why you were interested in it, why didn't you ask Colonel North, how much are we getting out of these sales for the Contras?
I don't recall, frankly, ever thinking about that. I knew that the arms sales were going through. I had a rough idea of the amount of money involved from the early discussion in February. I knew that a portion of that would go. But with all of the other issues that I was involved with during the year, I simply didn't get into that detail of micromanagement of the project that Colonel North was working on.
Well,
I've told you that was not my
Right.
style.
And I take it from that answer that even though there was an NSPG meeting dedicated to raising $15 million from third countries for the Contras, you regard it as micromanagement to ask Colonel North how much are we getting out of these arms sales for the Contras?
Told you yesterday, I did not have an opportunity before that NSPG meeting to talk to Colonel North. He often wanted to come to see me when I didn't have time. In
Well,
fact,
what about
I
after
think he got very frustrated with it.
Well, what about
Afterwards, he did send me a props note, which you have in an exhibit,
which said $6
which
million?
has $6 million in it.
Did you ever ask him, apart from that prof note, did you ever ask him, how much have we gotten for the Contras out of all of these sales?
I'm sorry, Mr. Lyman, would you...
I mean, I take it that you've already said that you never asked him after that memo, how much have we actually gotten from the Contras out of all these sales? That you've already said.
Yes, I don't recall asking him.
Okay, now, Colonel North has testified about the threats to his life, and I think everyone was very moved by that. Are you the person who turned down his request for a security system?
Well-
Mr. Lyman,
Did you get, let me phrase
all
it,
kinds of things. Is there a more delicate way you could phrase that?
yes. I can phrase it. Did Colonel North request a security system?
I don't recall his requesting one, but I am certain that he did. One regret I have after hearing Colonel North's testimony about that is that I didn't follow up on it personally. I was aware of the Abu Nidal threat against Colonel North. I have a vague recollection that he came to me and indicated his concern, and my recollection is I asked him to speak to one of my assistants, and it was probably Rod McDaniel, the executive secretary, or possibly Commander Thompson, my military assistant, and ask Ollie to talk to them about the problem and see what could be worked out. I don't recall following up on it. As I say, I regret that I didn't, and I suspect Colonel North thought at the time that I wasn't concerned enough about the security of him and his family.
Well, did he take
I should have been.
Did he take it up with you personally after it got lost in the NSC?
He may have. I don't
Just
recall
don't
it.
remember it. Okay, now, do you remember that after the Hassenfuss plane went down, that Mr. de Graffenried of the NSC came to you with some documents or talked to you about some documents?
Yes, as I have testified to you before.
That's privately, that what you're talking about when you testified before, not yesterday.
That's right. It was on the 2nd of May.
Right.
In trying to recall what I knew about any destruction of documents, I did recall that sometime, and I believe it was in October, Mr. de Graffenried, who was the Special Assistant to the President for Intelligence Affairs, came to me and indicated his concern about Colonel North's exposure as alleged in the newspapers at that time. Primarily, as I recall, it was connected with various allegations about the Hassenfuss aircraft. Mr. de Graffenried asked me if I recalled that there were some memoranda in System 4, which this committee has had explained to it before, I think, that talked about some of Colonel North's activities. And I told Mr. de Graffenried that I had a vague recollection of some memos in System 4 from back in '84 and '85 that I had that I could recall that Colonel North had prepared to give Mr. McFarland updates on the logistics and supply situation for the Contras and the financing status, but I couldn't remember much about the memos. Mr. de Graffenried indicated his concern about the existence of those. I told him that that I frankly couldn't remember the memos very well, that they probably did reveal too much, and that he should go talk to Colonel North about them. The clear implication, both from my end of it and from Mr. Graffenried's end of it, was that we probably would be better off without those memos.
And did you ever tell Mr. de Graffenried, well, you've already said what you told him, that and the intent of your remarks was that those memos should be gotten rid of?
That, I don't recall the exact wording I used, but that was the clear intent of his question and my answer.
And did you know how to get System 4 documents out of the computer so that they would leave no traces? I know you're a computer expert. You've told me that, and that's your hobby, but were you an expert in getting them out of System 4?
Not that particular system. What I think you're referring to is that System 4 had, well, all of the numbered systems had computer-based indexes, but I'm not familiar with the software for that.
Did you ever either erase anything from that computer-based index of System 4?
I did not. The only
or
thing...
instruct anyone to erase something from that?
No, I did not.
Did you know until these hearings or the publicity surrounding them that Colonel North had altered the System 4 documents?
I was unaware of that.
He never told you?
That's correct.
And who were you trying to protect when you made the remarks, the clear intent of which was to get rid of these System 4 documents?
Well, as I've said all along, we were trying to protect the Contra support activity that the NSC staff was involved with. We didn't want that public.
Now, there then came a time when the Iran initiative was disclosed first in Lebanon, and then it became the subject of a great deal of controversy in the United States.
Yes.
And did you request that chronologies be prepared?
I did.
Now, are you aware of Colonel North's testimony last week that you were and this was his words, witting is his words, of the fact that these chronologies were being falsified to cover up the United States' involvement in the Israeli tow shipment in September and the Hawk transaction?
Mr. Lyman, as again I've testified on May the 2nd, I was aware that the chronologies were inaccurate. I've testified to that before. I also was not sure what the right answer was. There was a great deal of confusion in November of 1986 as to what had actually transpired in all of these events, and when we were on the West Coast when I was on the West Coast with the President on Election Day and the story in Al-Shara came out, I realized that we needed to prepare a chronology or a narrative as to what had actually transpired in the whole project. And shortly upon returning to Washington, I tasked Colonel North to prepare a chronology of the facts. I specifically told him to leave out the transfer of funds to the Contras. I considered that a separate issue, and that at that time we didn't feel would leak out or be connected, so I didn't want that issue in the chronology, but I expected the rest of it to be accurate. I also told Colonel North to talk to Mr. McFarland about it, because he was the one that was intimately involved in the early phases. I was very fuzzy at that point on the actions of July, August, September, October, and November of 1985.
Did you, other than the instruction to leave out the diversion, did you ask him to make these chronologies inaccurate with respect to the United States involvement in the Israeli shipments?
To answer your specific question, Mr. Lyman, I did not. The problem that we had was that at that point we didn't realize, I certainly didn't realize, and I don't think Colonel North realized, we had all of these old Prof's notes. We had purposefully limited the amount of paper on the issue, and I was very fuzzy on the initial stages. The chronology went through many drafts. I saw some of them. I invited Mr. McFarland to lunch at the White House on the 18th. The specific reason for inviting him to lunch was to encourage him to prepare a memorandum for record as to what had happened in the early stages of the project. I had asked Colonel North to do that earlier, and very frankly, Colonel North was having some difficulty in getting Mr. McFarland to recall exactly what had happened.
You said that you were aware that the chronologies were inaccurate in some respects.
Yes, that's correct. Some versions and some aspects.
And
Mr.
what,
Chairman, I just wanted to make clear that when we talk about chronologies, this is a stack of chronologies. I'm not sure if these are all of these, but they're not all inaccurate.
well,
And I
what,
think if we're going to talk about inaccurate chronologies, it might be helpful to talk specifically about
Well,
which one.
well-
Because there are many references in these chronologies to the shipments in some that are not in others.
Mr. Beckler, let me just summarize that the chronologies went from early ones, which Colonel North has testified to, which were essentially accurate, saying that the United States had approved or acquiesced in the Israeli shipment of tows and described the Hawk transaction, to the last ones, which said that the United States had objected to the Israeli tow shipment and indicated that the November shipment to the United States' knowledge involved oil drilling equipment. My question of you, sir, is when you just said a moment ago you were aware that there were inaccuracies, what did you have in your mind?
What I had in my mind was that the section in the last version that was prepared before Colonel North and I left, and I think it's dated the 20th of November, as I recall, the section about the Hawks I felt was inaccurate at the time,
Now,
in November of 1986.
now, Admiral,
But the problem was that I didn't know what the right answer was at that time.
did anybody at the White House ask you to prepare inaccurate chronologies?
Absolutely not. That was not my objective, and nobody suggested that.
And no one gave you that charge?
Nobody.
Now, you have heard from following these proceedings testimony by Mr. Cooper, then by Colonel North, about the meeting in your office or at the White House on November 20.
Right.
On November 20, did you meet with Mr. Casey, the Attorney General, Mr. Cooper, Colonel North, and Mr. Gates in order to discuss Mr. Casey's upcoming testimony before the intelligence committees and your briefing to those committees?
Early in the month of November,
First, could you say, did you have that meeting?
we had that meeting, and I
Right,
want
now
to tell you
explain
how it
this.
came about. Early in November, Ed Meese called me and indicated that he wanted to be helpful he recognized at that point that eventually we were going to have to go public or at least brief the congressional committees on the finding, and he wanted to offer his assistance in doing that. I had several conversations over the month with Ed, and finally, the week of 17 November, the President, up to that point, had taken the position, which I certainly fully supported, was that we would still try to protect as much of the information about the project as possible. The President felt, and I agreed with him, that we still had an opportunity to get some of the hostages out, and we wanted to salvage what we could of the second channel. But the week of the 17th, it became more and more clear that we were going to have to go public. Director Casey had left on that Monday, as I recall, for a trip to Central America. At some point during the week, we agreed to brief the two congressional intelligence committees on Friday. Director Casey was not scheduled to come back to the United States until Thursday night, the night before. I can recall the week of the 17th calling Ed Meese and telling him that either I had already or was going to call Bill Casey down in Central America. And in fact, I think you have a tape of that conversation in one of your exhibits. I did not realize the conversation was taped at the time, but I guess CIA taped it.
Let me just interject that was an exhibit that I asked to have declassified so it could be used for purposes if this subject came up. It's a contemporaneous tape of the conversation that my client had with the late Director Casey, which I think will enable the committee to have some understanding of what kind of a dialogue they were having about this. But as of 10:30 today, I still haven't had it declassified. I made the request last week.
As you know, we do not control the declassification process, Mr. Beckler, but
The White House controls the declassification process, and also the independent counsel clears on what documents the White House can transmit as well.
you have read that tape?
I have not. I
Read the transcript of it, I mean?
I have not read it. But anyway, let me go on. I have a vague recollection of the conversation.
Let me just explain why the Admiral has not read it. I think it's important. He has not read it because the document was one that could not be taken from this building, and when we became aware of it last week, the Admiral was not with us here in this building, over on the Senate side, in the Hart Building.
But I told Bill that I thought it would be helpful if he came back from Central America early so that he and I would have a chance to talk about the briefing that I was going to provide the intelligence committees and the hearing that he was going to attend up here on the Hill on Friday. He readily agreed to come back. At that point, there was a great deal of confusion still as to what had actually happened. in 1985. I told Ed that I was going to ask Bill to come back and ask him to come to a meeting in my office on the Thursday preceding the briefings that he and I were to give. And so he agreed to come, and Bill Casey came back, and we had the meeting.
Would you look at Exhibit 68?
Interrupting you, it's 10:30, about a break time here. Is this an appropriate point for a break? The committee will take a 10-minute recess.